Welcome to the Serious Leisure podcast. My name is Petya Petrova. I'm your host for today's podcast. Each episode features guests and their stories of remarkable, humorous, and often unexpected experiences that happen when we get serious about leisure. We interpret and examine these experiences through the lens of Robert Stebbins' landmark concept of serious leisure. Our conversations with our guests and regular contributors help us understand and hopefully reevaluate the place of leisure in our lives. Today, I'm joined by our podcast contributors, Dr. Sam Elkington and Kat Branch. Sam is from Teesside University. He is our serious leisure expert. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you, Petya. Pleasure to be here as always.
Kat leads the University of the West of England Centre for Music. Welcome, Kat.
Good afternoon, everybody.
For those of you new to the podcast, welcome. Thank you for joining us and our quest for a balanced life. You may notice that we often abbreviate the University of the West of England to UWE. We are very excited to welcome today our two podcast guests, Dr. Harriet Shortt and Dr. Rob Grieve. Harriet is an associate professor in organisation studies at UWE's Faculty of Business and Law. Welcome, Harriet.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Lovely to be here.
Rob is a senior lecturer in physiotherapy at UWE's Faculty of Health and Social Sciences. Welcome, Rob.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Friday afternoon conversation on serious leisure. As typical for those of you who listen regularly, we start with the professional context and professional roles of our guests. I would ask Rob and Harriet to introduce themselves and just what their roles at UWE currently involve. Can I start with Harriet, please?
Sure. So I am an associate professor in organisation studies, as you said. So I work in the organisation studies cluster in Bristol Business School in the Faculty of Business and Law. I've got two core research interests. So part of my role is very research orientated. And so I do research on the lived experience of workplaces and spaces. So I'm interested in the materiality of work and how our workplace environments impact our everyday lives. And then my other research interest is that of visual methods. So I'm interested in using visual and arts-based methods to explore people's experiences of work. My role also includes business engagement work. So I do a lot with CPD and our executive education team. I also head up the faculty's apprenticeship scheme. So looking after all of our apprenticeship programs. So a bit of teaching, bit of research, and a bit of business engagement. That's my role.
Sounds a little busy. For listeners, Harriet is nodding quite seriously at the moment. Rob, can you tell us a little about your role, please?
Right, yeah. So I'm a senior lecturer in physiotherapy. I've been at UWE since 2002. I'm basically involved in teaching, the research, and I have also been more sort of active since 2015 in supporting students with their fear of public speaking. Now, I'm sure you can hear I'm not the most fluent person. And as a lecturer, I had a lot of challenges in actually speaking to large groups of students. And that in turn actually inspired me to, I suppose, recognize the challenges that many of our students have in actually having to speak publicly. That's just very sort of briefly my role.
Thanks, Rob. And knowing Rob, he actually abbreviated a fair bit of what he does at UWE and in his role, which I'm sure will come through in different ways during this conversation. We start this podcast with what you do for a living and what your role involves, but we also start with the origin stories of your serious leisure pursuits. I wasn't quite sure what to title these pursuits today. So for the purposes of our audience, we just call them serious artistic pursuits today, and we'll find out a little more about it in a moment. So we'll start with Rob this time, if that's okay, and just ask Rob to tell us where and how his journey engaging with the arts, and particularly with drawing, started, and where we find that journey at the moment and potentially where it is going next, please. Rob.
Right, yeah. So I have always been a bit of a frustrated cartoonist. I started doing cartoons in my early 20s. I then thought about going to art school, but actually thought that I just really didn't have the skills. So during all of my working life, I've been quite sort of involved in I've actually sort of moved on now. So I've been quite involved in printmaking, also been quite involved in painting. I've got a small sort of studio stroke sort of shed in the back of the garden. And that's my sort of space, because after a period of time, the dining room table became a bit cluttered, and you can imagine the chaos with easels and scalpel blades and sort of ink and all of that kind of sort of thing. I am a member of the Bath Society of Artists. I was elected in 2019, and I've been involved in exhibitions at the Victoria Art Gallery for the last 5 years. I've also been sort of doing more painting. So that's also been a bit of a move from the actual printmaking. But then again, the whole sort of mark making in liner cuts, I suppose you could actually transfer that to a painting. And then I also had a piece accepted when we're talking about the links with work at the World Congress of Physical Therapies in Singapore 2015. I actually won the first prize for a drawing. So these are all sort of validations, I suppose. But really, for sort of me, the real key is the whole aspect of creating art. So, if it's recognized, I suppose that's a bonus, but that's not the main aim. For me, it's an outlet.
Thank you. That's very impressive and very interesting, how you have started your passion from school age that didn't quite go into a professional route, but somehow it did. So not initially, but you kind of kept at it, and it became a semi-professional route with exhibitions, etc. We'll delve into that a fair bit in a moment, but I would like to find out a bit more about Harriet's history with the arts, and I would leave it at that, because similarly to Rob, we're talking being a cartoonist, printmaking, painting, so it's just difficult to pin it down to one thing. So Harriet, tell us about you, please.
Yeah, so I was giving this some thought, and before the podcast, and I mean, really, the origins, I think, are my parents. This is very much my sort of artistic, creative, aesthetic appreciation for things comes from my parents, who are both artists. My mum's a fine artist and illustrator, and my dad's a graphic designer. So I guess I've always been surrounded by art, design, fabric, interior design, conversations about wallpaper and the colours of carpets and that kind of thing. So I think there was definitely some sort of osmosis situation going on where I kind of absorbed some sort of aesthetic awareness. And I always enjoyed drawing and painting as a child. And my only claim to fame really pales into insignificance with Rob. But I won the W.H. Smith Christmas card design competition about 5 years in a row when I was about, I don't know, maybe 7 to, when I was a bit older and not really interested in it anymore, but kept drawing designs for Christmas cards and winning. So I met, Bob Holness and Andy Peters and Jane Asher at various events to celebrate the artwork. But really, I was a maker of things. I wanted to make things. I was interested in mixed media and fabric, and so I didn't really sort of follow my parents' sort of interests or their skills. I was kind of interested in three-dimensional things. So I had a fantastic art teacher at GCSE, and I think I'm sure lots of listeners and we as a team can sort of relate to getting a good teacher. I think early on makes such a difference, and she really encouraged me to embrace this idea of making stuff. So I made a big wire Icarus for my GCSE art, and like Rob did some printing and lino cutting for feathers, and you use lots of different approaches, and really loved that. And I made a fabric fish, which I've still got framed somewhere, and I loved that. But at A level, and I was thinking about going into art school, and obviously was surrounded by this influence. But A level had a really good teacher who only really wanted us as a class to work in oils and work big. And that was just really far removed from where I was and my passion. So I think my creativity was lost there. And I think at that point as well, looking back, you don't necessarily want to do what your parents did. And I mean, it's ironic that, my mum taught and was an artist, and I sort of veered away from that. And then, of course, have come back round. And now I do teach. And I'd consider myself sort of maybe half an artist. But I really let that lie and that creative side die for quite a long time until I started my PhD in 2005. And over those first couple of years, I came across visual and arts-based methods. And that really appealed to me, that all of a sudden you could use the arts in some way as a route to investigating what it was you were going to investigate. And that was fantastic. Not viewed that well by the business school I was in, I have to say. But I had a fantastic supervisor, again, great cheerleader from the side, saying, yep, go for it, try it. And then, so I think my creativity kind of started to come back then. And then after submitting my PhD thesis, before my Viva, I had about 3 or 4 months where I didn't want to read my thesis again because that was just awful. I did not want to do that again. I had had enough. So I was compelled, having visited a quilt exhibition at the V&A. I was very inspired by Tracy Emin there, where quilts spoke of identity. And I thought, okay, I feel like I need to make a quilt of what I've just spent the last 4 years doing. So I made a quilt of my PhD. It's in my office at UWE on the French campus, if anyone would like to come see it. And it hangs there proudly. And I think that PhD quilt really marked the beginning of me saying, okay, actually, I'm going to embrace the creative side of me. I think it's been lost for too long. So very much went back to my creative side and visualizing things, and whether that was through work and through teaching and research, or whether it was visualizing making a quilt for a friend or making some fabric birds that said something about our friendship or whatever. So I find myself here now very much making space for that part of me, having lost it for a bit in the middle there.
Thanks, Harriet. Thanks, Rob. Well, as you can imagine, we have a lot to unpack here, and Kat is already keen and desperate to come in. So, Kat, do you want to ask your question, please?
Thanks, Petia. I was really struck, Harriet and Rob, in the comments that both of you made, especially Harriet, in some of what you've just been talking about the very unique role of meaning making from what you've said about what you're doing. A lot of our guests have talked about the importance of leisure for relaxation and escape, and I expect we'll touch on those topics. But the meaning making aspect, when I think about that quilt in your office, Harriet, is really interesting, and I wonder if there's something unique about the visual arts that links to its use in this way to bring meaning. I mean, Rob, you talked about an outlet, and Harriet, just to make a quilt from your PhD, that's such an unusual and extraordinary way of using your artistic skill. I wonder if either of you just like to comment on this meaning-making aspect and to what degree that drives your engagement with the visual arts and how important that is. Rob, did you want to start?
The whole thing about meaning, and I think one of the things that we might also be talking about is perfection. I think one of the things about art, for sort of me, art should be art for art's sake. And I have real sort of issues when we're asked to give a whole text about what our actual painting or what our work actually means. And for me, I really feel that art is such a subjective thing, and that each person should be able to make their own impression of what that art means to them. And also, I suppose you could also say what it means to the person who actually made it.
Yes. Okay. Yes, I understand that, Rob. Because I think, in fact, the meaning making I'm thinking of is exactly what you've just articulated, that sense of the producer of the art, so you as the artist, expressing a significant meaning in what you're doing, not necessarily for someone looking at it to receive that. It's moot, but actually that the act of saying whatever it is you want to say, that in itself is enough, which is quite interesting. It's not particularly about you listed an extraordinary amount of artistic achievements, Rob, in your opening section, but
Sorry.
I loved no, not at all. It was an extraordinary list, but interestingly, you said that was not the heart of it for you. It's actually doing it. It's actually making those pieces of art, and this is where I'm imagining that meaning is taking place. You as the artist are making something, and when I think about Harriet making that quilt, it's that same thing. I'm not imagining Harriet would take that quilt to a discussion and say, well, if you look at this quilt, you'll then understand various aspects. No, not at all. No. The value there is in fact the meaning that's come from the maker.
I think one of the sort of problems I've often sort of had is, are you making art, or is there meaning for you, or are you making art that you know or think that other people will actually like? So there's this whole sort of internal dialogue that I always have. But am I doing stuff? Should it be maybe more figurative? Should I be less abstract? Should I be doing work that might give meaning, or I know that people might actually prefer? And that's always been, I think, a real sort of struggle that's actually linked to the meaning of what this art actually means to me.
Quite curious, having never engaged with any of the visual arts or artistic pursuits. It's never too late, I guess. I was just wondering, Rob, when you have this internal dialogue, and do you then make an explicit choice? Are you mindful of, today I'm actually producing something that I think might be well received, or I have an external audience in mind, or today I'm just kind of letting go and expressing myself? Are you mindful of one day leaning one way and the next day leaning the other? And if you are, how does it feel engaging in these two different orientations, I guess, to you producing your art?
It's a tricky one, because I've always found it quite sort of easy to do a figurative stuff, but I've been trying to do more abstract work. And I don't know, there's a sort of a part of me that actually thinks if I maybe did more of the sort of figurative work, I might get more sort of likes on Instagram, as opposed to if I do some of the abstracts, work. But once again, and because there's always been that cartoonist in me, when I start doing the more sort of serious inverted commas sort of work, I'm always suddenly sort of tempted to do like a bit of a cartoon. I think, oh, hang on, so I'm always sort of torn. And I suppose maybe it's just the way I am. I'm a sort of a jack of all trades, a master of none. I feel I can actually do both of them, but once again, there's always this actual internal conflict.
It's really interesting, Rob, and I think some of that speaks to the heart of whether something, how leisurely something might be, and to what degree it starts to cross into our professional identity there. I wonder, Harriet, would you like to tell us a bit about this meaning-making aspect for you and bring some of your insight to this?
Yeah, I've sort of been nodding away there. I think certainly for me, when I was thinking back to when I made the PhD quilt, it was for nobody but myself, because essentially I didn't want to read my thesis again. I'm not really a text person. I'm obviously in entirely the wrong job because I'm dyslexic and reading takes me longer, and so it's not ideal when academic worlds like mine in a business school are still very, very text-based, very text-driven. So I didn't want to read this thesis again, and I found it so linear. I had this sort of 80,000 word document that was just very one page after another. And what I really needed to make sense of for myself was the story, and I wanted to be able to tell the story and visualize it. I am, as I've explained, a visual person, and I've just got to see it. So it was a private problem-solving exercise, I think, for me. It was lovely. There was a whole relaxation, sort of restorative part of playing with fabric and stitching and being still and not by a computer, but sort of saying, okay, well, how would I represent my literature review? How would I represent Foucault's Panopticon, in a button or something? I mean, there's a question. So and how would I represent a broken sense of identity in a piece of fabric? So I like that whole problem solving aspect of it, but it was very much to be able to have this massive thing that you can hold up and say, okay, with that in front of me, I can totally talk about my thesis now. I can absolutely tell you what is going on, the decisions I made, and I've got visual prompts. Whereas, I mean, I write loads of notes, when I go to meetings, I'm writing notes now. I never look back at them. I don't know why I do it. It's not very helpful because I look at words and go, but actually I want to see a picture and then I'm totally fine. That sort of making sense of the story of my PhD visually was very much mine. But interestingly for me, I think looking back, it was private and almost, I was almost embarrassed. Didn't want to share it with anyone. And so it was just for me. And then it was only when my husband's best friend came over to our house and saw it and was like, oh, that's fantastic. Like, you should show people. I was like, oh. Then I showed my supervisor, who fortunately didn't think I'd lost the plot before the Viva. And he was like, okay, you can take it to the Viva. And I thought, what? And he said, no, you can take it to the Viva, take it in a bag. If there's a moment that's appropriate, get it out and show them. But feel the room first. I was like, okay. So it did get seen eventually, but it started off as, very much something for me.
It's interesting because it's so deeply personal. I wondered, Harriet, how that felt, creating something that just a process for yourself. How did it feel while you were doing that? And what was that like for you when you completed it?
There was something very restorative about it. As I said, there was something very not like anything I'd done for the last 4 years of writing a PhD and doing research. It was it felt lovely to be sorting out buttons and thinking about fabric and ironing fabric and sewing and sitting in different spaces in my house and sewing. And so there was something really lovely about that. There was something sort of very reflective about it. It was something very, I guess there's something about identity in there, about how I was sort of thinking about what the process that I'd just gone through as a PhD student, but also reflecting on my work and actually what was important in the work. And I found myself adding found objects to the edges of the quilt to kind of represent where I'd come from. So I had a really, really crap job after my master's, before I did my PhD and travelled for a bit. I had a really terrible job in retail that I was so miserable at, and it was really awful, and had a horrible boss. But I still had my badge, like my staff badge, and I put that into the quilt because actually it was just symbolic of actually past, present, future self. So yeah, there was something really important about thinking about me and having just gone through. I mean, anyone who's done a PhD will know it's quite a painful process. So at times joyful, but yeah, it was important for me to reflect on that, and it was great to have it finished. It was a great piece, and then I got brave and braver with sharing it, and then I realized other people might think a bit like me, and actually this whole visualizing thing is actually quite useful for people, and it wasn't just me being weird.
Thanks, Harriet. I'm stopping myself from saying this is so fascinating. in a previous recording, you wouldn't know, but I referred to you can do a drinking game on how often I use the word fascinating in one of our recordings. I'm really intrigued. First of all, I wish I had that artistic outlet after I finished my PhD, and I also found it quite a traumatic experience that you needed to somehow process and let go of. So I think that's we should do that as an intervention after people's PhD vivers or after they submit, for sure. The thing that I'm intrigued for in the context of the answers both of you gave is the expression of self, but also the bravery, because the therapeutic, the letting go element, I can understand the kind of the mindful, the pouring yourself into a piece of art. I can imagine and understand that as somebody who hasn't been engaged in the arts in that way. But there's a bit of bravery about then sharing it with others, and then starting to do it with the idea that you might share your art with others. And there's a bit of bravery in claiming that identity as an artist in the act of sharing with that. So I was just wanted to ask you both to really tell me if you feel brave. I mean, Harriet, you said you felt brave but with that piece and with other pieces. And if I can start again with Rob, please. Can you, Rob, do you feel that you're a brave person?
For me, bravery was standing up in front of 100 students giving a lecture. That for me was actually bravery, and that might have been linked to my speech. And by actually doing that lecturing, doing that thing that people find scary, has really helped massively with my actual fluency. As regard my artwork, I suppose one of the things that quite a few people say is, I know you need to have a thick skin, and you need to do the work that you feel has got a meaning, something that you believe in, even if others might not actually like it. And it is also very difficult when you get negative feedback about your work. But I think, once again, I think this actually just goes back to the whole thing. If it is something you really believe in and something you're actually passionate on, or passionate, excuse the Greek, about, I think that in a way sort of supersedes all the sort of bravery questions or bravery challenges.
Thanks, Rob. And I guess we all do develop a really thick skin whilst we're lecturing, and we are open to critique and the gaze of others, and feedback, etc. So it's interesting to think that our lecturing roles make us not so much braver, but just enable us to undertake other pursuits. And I will definitely take this with. I've spoken previously about my improv theatre journey that only started 2-3 years ago. And sometimes people think it's quite scary, but I find I have had scarier lectures and workshops than actually, messing about in front of an audience doing theatre. So it's interesting to think of it in that direction. We often talk about how our hobbies enable our skill sets for work, and you're talking about it in the other direction. Harriet.
Yeah, I think the bravery one's an interesting one, and perhaps is one that for me has grown. It's sort of an incremental thing. So what started with the quilt and was shared in the Viva with my examiners and was received so well, and I guess there's that validation from others that plays a part here. So having a positive reaction, I guess, going back to Rob's point about sort of getting the feedback, I think it's that sort of relational dynamic, isn't it, between you, the artwork, other people, the audience, whoever might be involved in that, and that sort of helps to build this sense of bravery. I felt pretty brave ignoring lots of other much more senior academics when I was a PhD student, when I said that I was going to use photography as a research method, which was then in business and management just like, what are you doing? That's so left field. I mean, sociologists, anthropologists, they've been doing it for years. That's okay. But because I was in a business school, and it's sort of and I don't want to be disingenuous to sort of business schools, but, you know, it's sort of seen as kind of serious, you know, it's sort of a serious place. It's about business and organizations and that kind of thing. And where I was doing my PhD, you know, it was pretty traditional, pretty traditional business school. And so the idea that you'd be using visual methods, and my PhD was on hairdressers. So I think, you know, that was like really left field. So they were just like, what? So hairdressers for a start as a context, and then you're using photography. So, but it was having that PhD supervisor, that research mentor who really sort of propelled me forward, and then finding other people who were sort of carving their path too. And I met Professor Samantha Warren at Portsmouth University, and she'd been using visual methods. She and I are sort of now best buds and, you know, write together all the time. But I remember meeting her and getting very drunk talking about arts-based methods, and wasn't it really fantastic? We're going to change the world, you know, business and management methodology and all this kind of thing. But again, that relational thing was really important. And I just think for me, just being able to do little bits now and then, and experimenting a bit with your audiences. You know, I took a mind map that I'd drawn with pens, you know, on a piece of paper instead of a PowerPoint, to a university validation panel for a new program the other week, and I wasn't laughed out the room, and somebody else liked it, and actually it was really helpful for people to visualize certain aspects of the new program. So you just never know, and it's all those little things, I think, that sort of knitted together have created a space where I'm now like, you know what, this is actually inherently part of who I am, and so I am going to embrace that and go with that, and I feel much braver than I did, you know, 15 years ago.
It's really interesting, Harriet, how as you're talking, as you've rediscovered that part of your artistic identity that got smooshed down in your A-level experience, that as time's gone on, I was just listening to you speaking, and how actually, in a way, you've kind of woven these two identities back together. You know, that's what I'm hearing, a sense of your professional self who's just been carrying on this whole time, and then you kind of resuscitated artistic self, and now you're kind of intersecting the two, which is fantastic. It's just kind of life goals for those of us who are listening.
Just to say, I feel really lucky to have been able to do that, because I don't think it's easy or common for us to be able to find ways to knit together a professional self and then other parts of who we are or what we're passionate about. And so to be able to do that, and you know, I think is a really lucky thing to be able to do, and I'm always up for exploring that further as my career progresses. I mean, my first job was at UWE, and I have to give UWE credit here for allowing me, you know, if I don't know if that's the right word, but giving me space to do that, because it was maybe a few months from my viva when I got my job at UWE as a lecturer, and it was my first boss who said to me, I said, "Oh, do you think I could use objects and pictures in this seminar class? You know, is that too weird? And is that a bit..." And unlike where I'd come from, where it was kind of really traditional, my first boss at UWE, Graham Baker, said, "No, do it. Great. Sounds fantastic. Do it. And if it doesn't work, don't do it again. We'll try something else." And he was just so cool about it. And that was from the word go. And so I always feel UWE's helped support me through experimenting with some of this stuff, and I've been really lucky to have worked with a lot of people who've embraced it, and we've worked together on these sorts of projects where we're able to bring the visual into assessments and teaching and research, and that's just been great. So I think, again, if you're surrounded by people that can help support you in that way, I think that's really important.
I'm just wondering, both Harriet and Rob, given the kind of interesting, Harriet, in your case, this kind of weaving into your professional self, this artistic part of yourself that we've just been talking about. And Rob, from your point of view, you mentioned thinking about prospective audiences and how to get more followers and how to get more engagement. These are the kinds of processes we often associate with our professional selves as well, really, although I'm sure Sam will dive in here in a few minutes to bring us that serious leisure perspective as well, and the ways in which that comes into a serious leisure career. I suppose my question is, in that context, how do you maintain your artistic space as one that can recharge you and still continue to give you a place for, for relaxation, for the kinds of things we need to use leisure for with our pressured lives. Are you able to do that? And if so, how are you doing that? If these two things are kind of blending together, Harriet, in this really interesting and effective way, or Rob, if in fact there's a part of you that's really operating with a sort of professional paradigm around your drawing and work. So how do you get your leisure to still help and support you and give you this sort of safe boundaried space away from professional pressures? Is it working like that? Rob, would you like to jump in there?
Yeah. So as I say, I mean, I've got this small sort of shed in the back of the garden, a studio, and I'm a bit of a early bird, so I tend to be up every morning at about 6 o'clock, which is a little bit sort of sad. And I tend to find, if I'm doing any writing or anything at all, I tend to work really well in the morning. So often I'll actually sort of I'll go up there, and that's where I can often do sort of work in the mornings. But yeah, for sort of me, I don't want to use a sort of a cliche term, but I feel that it's actually really a sort of part of me. I don't sort of really sort of see doing the artwork as a sort of separate thing. I actually sometimes have a sort of physical need to, I know, sorry, I'm sounding all, but I have a physical need to actually create. I have, I'm sort of doodling and drawing on things. I mean, I've been drawing on walls. I've been literally, I've got one half of my actual studio. I've actually used a acrylic pen and drawn on the wall. I also try and sort of use this as well in my teaching. So one of the things I've said before, when I'm teaching anatomical stuff, we'll actually get students to physically draw the musculature, on themselves. So always for sort of me, art is not a actual either or. It's actually part of the whole thing, It's a creative process. And sorry, and just one sort of quick one. I went to a very interesting talk at one of the advanced HE conferences, and they spoke about academic boredom. And for me, that was absolutely key to all the things I try and sort of do. So when I'm involved in teaching, seminars, any of these kind of things, try and make the work we do, make it not boring, because there's nothing worse than actually boring students or making students bored. So that's, anyway, sorry, that's going off on a bit of a tangent, but trying to be creative and trying to do things differently. Yeah, that's really my take.
Okay, so I have about 14 pages of notes, so bear with me. Okay, so obviously not said a great deal up to this point, but believe me, I've been making lots and lots of notes. So much interesting detail in here in terms of your various kind of professional lives and how that's interwoven with your leisure pursuits. I mean, from a serious leisure perspective, what we're looking at here, we're looking at what are effectively very specialized hobbyist activities, which are craft based, right? So and within that you've got those the different elements of that in terms of specialized skills and techniques, and media, all of those different kinds of things. But what I'm really interested in hearing in both of your descriptions are the means of expression. But the first point I want to make is one of my first notes on page 1 of 14 was, Rob, your point around, well, I feel very strongly that art is for art's sake, and that's really the motivation, is just to do it. There's an autotelic that to give that a kind of a way of understanding. There's an autotelic flavor to that, and what we mean by autotelic is auto is self and telic is goal. So it's a goal unto itself in terms of the doing of the act of, whether it be quilting or cartoonist, the drawing the cartoons or whatever. Fundamentally, it's about just the doing of the core activity. But in the doing of the activity allows you to do different things. So you've both talked about, I've made notes around, it's a form of communication for both of you, but in different means. So communicating ideas around PhDs, or connecting ideas, and Rob trying to communicate in different ways through different media. But what it also is, it's the different means of representing those ideas and your work and yourself, different ways of acting as professional or as artist, or so different ways of doing that, and different forms of expression of a certain expertise in a certain medium, as well as your expression of a certain facet of your identity in relation to that. And I also wanted to pick out this idea of, and you were both very clear on this, I think, in terms of, well, it's about me and it's for me. And there's an element of authorship in all of this as well. So, I'm the author of the work. And, so it comes back to the idea of identity, which is a core component to serious leisure, is we identify very strongly with the core activity, but the activity, i.e. what I was talking about earlier on about that autotelic nature, in the doing of the activity, it becomes an expression of who I am and, what I deem to be important and valuable, and how I want to be seen. And another really nice point that Rob was making about, well, am I doing this for likes in terms of, being accepted by other artists in terms of the quality of my work or the nature of my work? And, in serious leisure pursuits typically built around a unique social world and a unique ethos within that social world. And that acceptance and recognition through those social worlds is often an element of that. But is it a core motivation? Well, I would suspect, based on your first point that you made and you started talking about, probably not. And certainly not for Harriet, because it was something that you kind of reclaimed as a form of maybe expressing a more authentic representation of who you are. So I guess, we're picking out all of the key components here. There's certainly a need for perseverance and significant effort in terms of honing those skills and techniques, and you've left parts of that and come back to it, and that kind of enduring kind of non-linear leisure career-like involvement is there for all to see, and how you've explicated that and talked about that. But a question I wanted to ask then of both of you after all of that is, how much of this is about reclaiming a sense of identity in relation to pursuing this serious leisure pursuit alongside your work, or how much of this is about exploration, so the art of the possible? Because I can hear both kind of in what you're saying, but I would be really interested, because that's part of navigating that relationship between leisure and work, isn't it, in terms of, well, what part of my identity am I trying to express here by doing this? And I just wonder whether you wanted to make a comment on that, and whether it is about reclaiming a part that's lost, or whether it's about exploring new parts of yourself that are maybe more authentically you. I'm kind of opening that up to the room, I guess, in terms of Rob or Harriet wanting to jump in. I can kind of hear both in what you're saying, but again, I'd be interested in your views and thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and it's only when people start asking you these sorts of questions, isn't it, that you start to think about it in more depth. For me, definitely reclaiming a sense of my identity that was lost. I think that's front and foremost for me, because, as I said at the beginning, being creative and this aesthetic appreciation for things is an inherent part of who I am. And I can see myself now, and all my professional interests and all that I write about and all that I do and all that I'm interested in. It all started when I was a child. And so, I'm interested in workspace and place and materiality of work and all this kind of, and objects and where people put things. And I moved my bedroom around nigh on every week. I think my parents would come in on a Sunday morning and just be like, oh, right, okay, what's happened in here? And, I needed another extension lead or some blue tack, or, and I was arranging my space. And I think there was something there that got lost and then re-emerged. And it was the same with practicing art, and it was the same with visualizing things. There was a weird dip of resentment embarrassment, something being squashed out of me. I don't know. It was just sort of not good. And I remember looking at things on social media, for example, and being resentful of other artists and being resentful of, and thinking, oh yeah, okay, well, crowded market, you know, whatever. And looking through, and actually now all I follow on Instagram artists and textile artists and people who work with mixed media and people who love Liberty fabrics and do weird things with them, love all that. And now I'm not resentful. I'm happy, and I'll happily look at those things, and it makes me happy. So I think there's a reclaiming and a centering of that, and an appreciation of the balance that I think I was out of balance for a while. I was all about doing and action and goals and targets and driven, and I guess none of us can really get away from that because we work in higher education and academia, so we are very driven by that. And I think that's a problem because we lose the other side of us, which is contemplative and still and reflective, and often arts-based creative practices are in that space and not the mad doing of emails and all this kind of stuff. So I feel like that reclaiming has also centered and balanced me. As for the exploration of the art of the possible, as soon as you said that, I'm not sure whether this is what you meant, but as soon as you said that, I thought, actually, there's a bit of that in what I do in my research, where I'm exploring now how much the organisations that I work with in research, for research purposes, for research projects, how much are they up for changing? How much are they up for embracing the visual? I mean, I was talking to Microsoft the other day with a picture, you know, that I'd drawn. Again, didn't take a PowerPoint slide, took a picture, and we had a really cool conversation about hybrid working, technology, and we just looked at the picture, and that was a really cool networking, interesting conversation. And so actually, there's space for exploration and bringing this. And again, I come from a business and management perspective in a business school. So it's very much like, actually, let's do things differently and explore what the visual arts have to offer for these sort of serious business people that we think might not like them, because secretly I think they do.
That's really, really interesting. I just want to jump in here before Rob comes in for his side, because can't let it pass. You were talking about contemplative practices, you were talking about balance, and slowing down. And I think how much of this is about exactly that. It's a slower mode of being, you know, in terms of, you know, it's not that it's a meritocracy in higher ed, in academic practice, you know, it's fast paced, it's linear, it's all of these different kinds of things that we've been talking about. And actually it's counter to how you've been describing that. So for me, I'm sat here thinking, well, yeah, this is about slowing down. It's not a new concept by any stretch, but you can't rush what you're doing. You can't rush, you know, these different forms of expression and exploration, particularly when they're an authentic representation of who you are. So I really, really like that. I just want to make that point before we move on. Rob, you want to jump in here? I think that's probably going to be our final comment.
Yeah. So I think for me, the key word is authenticity. And I know that's one of the terms that we've actually used previously. So I published a book last year called Stand Up and Be Heard, which is basically all about public speaking, because one of the things I was actually saying, you know, with all my sort of speech and all of those kind of things. And I also did all the illustrations in the book, which was a really, really nice sort of thing. But my whole thing about whether we're doing art, whether we're doing teaching and learning, whatsoever I'm actually doing, I really want to be authentic. I don't want to be perfect. And I think that's one of the things for me has been a sort of underlying process in all of my teaching and learning. And I know that one of the things that I've actually said sort of previously is all this pressure of students or to be perfect, and all this pressure of like us in our work to be perfect. And that actually goes for sort of art, you know, the whole thing, Sam, that you're also saying, I think we should be doing art for art's sake. You know, how can we judge whether a piece is actually good? What do we actually mean by that? And I have a real struggle when they grade students. This is going to be a little bit controversial, but I have a real struggle with the sort of grading for students in a GCSE or for sort of A levels. I mean, one person's idea of good art is absolutely atrocious to somebody else. So it's the whole sort of subjectiveness. It's the whole personalizing. It's the whole meaning. It's all of these things that are actually intertwined. So linking to sort of reclaiming, linking to exploration. I think for me, I'm always exploring. I'm always exploring as well in my learning. And, I did a PhD on myofascial pain, and my students always laugh when I actually say to them, I did a PhD, I spent 6 years in myofascial pain. I haven't got a clue about what the actual subject's about. And they all look at me and think, what's he actually talking about? And it's this whole thing about learning. It's a whole thing about exploring. And I think that's what art also, when you've got a blank canvas, do you always know what the actual outcome is going to be? And when you actually delve into it, you go down avenues and you go down things that you hadn't planned. And the same thing, I suppose, could be argued for some of the things that we do in teaching and learning. Even though we've got lesson plans, etc., things actually change.
Thank you, Rob. Harriet, what are your current plans for your kind of merging of your different parts of your career? I haven't preempted that question, but is there anything on the horizon that you want to share with us? And it's fine that if you say that you've shared everything you're currently involved in.
Yeah, I mean, I think my plans at the moment kind of go back to one of the questions I think that Kat talked about earlier, which is, how do you find time to have your artistic pursuits be part of sort of relaxing and that kind of thing. And so as I sort of head towards August, I plan to spend much of August in my wonderful craft room that my wonderful husband created for me last summer. He gave me most of the garage and converted it into a craft room, probably because he wanted all the stuff out of the house. So he didn't want to see any more bags of fabric and buttons. And I posted a picture of the craft room on Instagram after it was finished, and everybody commented on how lovely it was, but also where the hell was all that stuff before you had the craft room? One wonders. But no, I plan to spend time there making things for me and that aren't related to work, but I do have to work quite hard on that. I did find myself at a freehand machine embroidery course a couple of years ago, and as part of my leisure pursuits, and I found myself doing a freehand machine embroidery picture of Bristol Business School, no less, as a response to me making sense of a project that I had a big research project that I'd just done on the building, a big post-occupancy evaluation project. And I found myself just making this picture, it was almost like the PhD quilt, kind of representing findings around transparency and visibility in workspaces, in thread and different coloured threads and all this kind of thing. And I did sit there and think, what are you doing? Like, why do this? Because I was still really connected to work. And I find myself in these artistic pursuits often in those bits in between, those liminal spaces. And for a lot of academics and a lot of people working in higher education, August is like a bit of a breathing space. I say bit because I am aware that we all teach all the time and there are always boards and always resets, but there's a little bit of a dip, and I always find myself going into it making something that's sort of related to work, thinking, why are you doing this? And then I'll spend the rest of August making nice things that don't have anything to do with work. So last year I made some fabric birds. This year I'm going to make some fabric tulips, for no other reason than they look lovely. So I'll be doing that.
Thank you both. I think this will be one of the podcasts where we will see if we can include some hyperlinks to some of your arts and accounts, so that those our listeners can also have a look at what we've been talking about. Thank you so much to both of you for sharing your experiences with us. So formal thanks to our guests, Harriet Shortt and Rob Grieve, and our regular contributors, Kat Branch and Sam Elkington, for a fascinating conversation. Thank you to our wider podcast team, Julia Denman and Helga Ganos-Todir. Goodbye, everyone. Until next time, when we continue to talk about leisure, work and well-being, and what we can do to engage with leisure seriously. Goodbye.